The title of the article that I used for my Wikipedia page contribution is titled "The Impact of Historical Trauma on Health Outcomes for Indigenous Populations in the USA and Canada." Now, this article was a systematic review of 32 articles that identified correlations between health outcomes for Indigenous people and historical trauma that had been experienced. My contribution came under the Wikipedia page, Contemporary Native American Issues in the United States. I contributed to the subcategory of public health since the focus of this article identified the health outcomes for Indigenous people who had experienced historical trauma. Now, some of the historical trauma referenced in the systematic review included experiences with loss, and so some of that loss could be categorized as loss of our land, loss of our language, loss of our spiritual ways. And another major portion of the systematic review circulated around articles that focused on individuals who attended Indian boarding schools or who had direct family members that had attended Indian boarding schools. Now, at the end of that systematic review, it was affirmed that historical hardships experienced by previous Indigenous generations can have a transmitted impact on the health and well-being of current Indigenous generations. That is me quoting myself from my Wikipedia page. So, why should this be important to you? Now, in my experience, I have worked on a reservation for 4 years. I was also raised on the reservation. And in my experience, when it comes to individuals who don't have a lot of familiarity with some of the historical trauma that Native American students have experienced, or some of the trauma that their families have experienced, it's really hard to understand the dynamic between the student, their family, and school. Oftentimes I've seen teachers who don't have this knowledge or experience be really confused by why I guess in their words, why the family has a negative relationship with school, or why they're not as involved as they've seen other parents be in other school districts. And so as you move forward, I should say, in your career as a school counselor or a school psychologist, it is likely that you will encounter a student of Indigenous descent. And what's important to keep in mind is that that student has generations of families that have encountered significant trauma, just for that student actually to be sitting in that seat in that classroom. So what you might perceive as a negative relationship from the family when it comes to school, or disinterest, might actually be the result of historical trauma that has carried over through generation to generation. For example, if a student in the classroom has either parents or grandparents who attended Indian boarding schools, and those experiences were incredibly negative. So we're talking not being able to use their native language, not being able to see their family consistently, their culture not being affirmed within the classroom. Because that parent or grandparent's experience was negative when it came to their education and schooling, they might have a hard time feeling safe or welcomed in their child's school. And so that's just a key factor to keep in mind when working with students who come from, I guess any student really, who comes from a generation of historical trauma. All right, that only took me probably close to 41 takes to finish, and 2 wardrobe changes. But any feedback is greatly appreciated. Thank you for your time.